Now we get to the fun stuff with regard to interpreting the conditionals. So at least one out is the simpler kind of rule. Obviously, A requires B is pretty much as simple as it gets. Negatives are where it gets a little bit more complicated, so I'm just starting there. This relates to Harry's question about variables that could not both be in. If X is in, Y is out. If Y is in, X is out. This means at least one of the two must always be out. They conflict. They are mutually exclusive. So at least one's out. Maybe both will be out. You cannot have both in. I guess as human beings, we're prone to conflict because this is like the easier thing to get. People consistently get this one fine, but the other one is where they have trouble. But I'll start here. So here's how you might lay it out. 3 possibilities. We're using a T-chart. If X is in, Y is out. If Y is in, X is out. And maybe both are out. What I have not depicted is what happens, what I've not depicted is X and Y both being in, because that's impossible. Yeah, so some people will do a biconditional arrow with a slash through it. That's great. That's another nice way to do it. I don't typically do it that way, but you can. It's perfectly fine to do that. So this is the at least one out. 3 possibilities. I wouldn't list them all on the same diagram, but these are different ways they could play out in theory. And so for particular local questions, you might do any of those 3 depending on the circumstance. You might have a scenario where X was in and you'd be able to say Y was out. Or you might have a scenario where Y was in and you could say X was out. And then you might end up with a particular local hypothetical where both Y and X were out. But the X and Y in together is impossible. Now, here's an example. Original, if you eat cookies, then you won't eat donuts because they're both desserts. They're bad for you. You shouldn't have too many. Contrapositive, if you eat donuts, you cannot eat cookies. So at least one of them cannot be eaten. At least one cannot be in. And maybe you'll lack both. A parent's not going to force their kids to eat desserts, most likely. So you could lack both, but they will not permit the kid to have both of them together because it's too much sugar and it's almost bedtime. I'll go back to that for one more second in case anybody's writing it down, but again, you have the slides. Now, 3 possibilities specifically with this: C in, D out, D in, C out, maybe both of them are out. So this is exactly the same as the XY slide from before, just with this particular example. Now, the other one, at least one in, is where it gets a lot more complicated. And this is a consistent source of student confusion, so definitely listen up for this one. This relates to the question Ethan was asking from the grouping splitting game with Y and L. But I'll keep it to X and Y example here. If X is out, Y is in. If Y is out, X is in. That means at least one of the two must always be in. And maybe both of them will be in. But you cannot lack both. And this is really confusing because we see them side by side on the conditional statement. One's positive, one's negative. And we're prone to thinking about conflict, so we see, one's positive, one's negative. It could be that one's positive, one's negative, but not necessarily, because we got to look at the starting point. If you lack one, you have the other. It's establishing a minimum for what needs to be in at least. If you lack one, you have the other. But if we were told Y is in, what would be true? What could we infer if Y is in?
If Y is in, we can't infer anything.
Exactly. So kind of a trick question, but you got it. Exactly. If Y is in, we don't know where X is. X could be in, could be out. We couldn't possibly say. We can only make inferences about what happens when Y is out or when X is out. So starting with a negative. So if they say, if X is out, we can make an inference. If they say, if Y is out, we can make an inference. But if they told us a positive like Y is in or X is in, we cannot infer anything. So it is entirely possible to have both. It's entirely possible to have both of them in. Really tough to absorb. I've made tons of mistakes on this back when I was studying. I even had the old notes at some point where I caught myself making this mistake. It's entirely possible to have both of them in at the same time. This simply establishes a minimum saying you've got to have at least one of the two in. So here's what those possibilities could look like diagrammed. Maybe you have Y out activating the rule that you have X in. Or maybe you have X out activating the rule that you have Y in. And maybe you have both of them in. But you see, what's missing here is having both X and Y out, because that is impossible given this conditional rule. And so in a conditional statement, I see a question in the chat related to this from Alana. If you have a conditional statement saying, if X out, then Y in, you cannot start with the variable on the right side of the arrow, in this case, Y in, to infer anything at all, because there's no continuation from that point. You can only follow the arrows in the direction in which they're pointing. So X out requires Y in. If you were told Y in, you don't know anything else at all about the position of X. X could be in, could be out in that particular circumstance. So you wouldn't be able to make an inference on that basis. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.